My name is Ron Lake. Thank you all very much for coming. And let me also start with just a few quick thank yous, and then we'll turn it over to our special guests, Senator Joe Lieberman and Secretary of the Treasury Larry Summers. First, thank you to Steve McMenamin and to Rich Richmond, my co-host, for organizing this morning's event. And thank you all for coming. Welcome to the Bruce Museum, a special island of artistic reflection and calm here in Greenwich, otherwise known as a nefarious hotbed of hedge fund activity. The area is actually should be known as a very broad and very deep community of financial and investment and business activity. So again, thank you all very much for your attendance and support this morning. With that, let me just turn it over to Rich Richmond, and we'll get started very shortly.
Now, I'm going to be a second. Before Senator Lieberman introduces the Secretary, I just want to point out that Senator Lieberman's wife is here this morning, Adasa Lieberman. We're very happy to have her. Senator Lieberman just celebrated his 10th annual 49th birthday. But in the interest of time, we won't sing happy birthday. Today's is really a quite unusual event. Instead of the typical political breakfast, we try to have something that's substantive given the nature of our guests in terms of the new economy and other issues facing federal policy. With that, Senator Lieberman.
Thank you very much, Joe, and I'm glad to be here with you and with your wife, Hadassah, because of what you have done for this country over the years. You know, I think we do have a new progressive politics in this country. It's based on the idea that a strong economy is the most important thing for achieving all of our objectives, whether it's jobs for Americans, whether it's strong national defense, whether it's social inclusion. It's based on the idea that the politics of inclusion and giving everybody a chance at prosperity is the right politics rather than the politics of envy. It's based on the idea that the most powerful means we have found to harness human economic energy is markets, and that government's role needs to be to create a framework in which markets can do their job. And you have been, whether the issue is fiscal virtue, whether the issue is keeping the American economy open, whether the issue is promoting savings, as with your work on individual development accounts, you really have been a leader for all of those causes and have really defined what a new progressive approach to the economy means. This will be much more interesting for me, and I suspect for you, if I don't give a speech, but rather just answer questions. So let me just make these remarks. First, American economy looks good to me. You know, one of the things that business cycle experts have learned is that business cycles are not like people or light bulbs. People are more likely to die as they get older. Light bulbs are more likely to go out after they've been on longer. There is no natural tendency for business cycles to be more likely to end because they've been going on for a long time. That doesn't mean that this one will last forever, any more than saying someone is healthy means saying that they are immortal. But it does mean that I think we can take a lot of satisfaction in an investment-led expansion that's been created by our fiscal virtue so far. What are the things that one should worry about? I think there are three dominant concerns that one should have even in these good times. And let me, from a macroeconomic point of view, and let me just tick them off. The first is complacency over-optimism, a sense of continuing euphoria. To paraphrase FDR, one of the main things we have to fear is the lack of fear itself. It leads to excessive leverage. It leads to excessive capacity creation. It leads to unsustainable spending plans. As so often in the past, those things can prove to be their own undoing. So I think it is very important that even as we take pride in what we have accomplished, we not lose sight of the inherent risks in economic life. Second thing we have to be concerned about is what has been the traditional pattern since the Second World War, through which business cycles ended, and that is imbalances between supply and demand. Let me be clear. In my judgment, anything that expands the supply potential of this economy is a good thing, whether it is rising productivity growth, whether it is increased education, whether it is greater availability of labor. But experience suggests that when demand grows faster than supply, the situation becomes difficult to control and the economy often skids into recession. Something like that is the story of 1958, of 1967, of 1971, of 1975, of 1982, and of 1990. And I've just listed most of the recessions that we've had. What are the policy implications? First, the importance of maintaining the budget surplus, of avoiding taking steps that risk overheating the economy, and of working to increase the amount that Americans save. Second, the importance of addressing what are the bottlenecks in our economy. And those bottlenecks are today heavily on the labor market side. And that's why issues that were once moral issues of schooling, of welfare to work, of helping those with disabilities to work, are today macroeconomic issues because of what they mean for the supply of labor and the risk of the economy overheating. And that makes a whole set of traditional democratic priorities all the more important. So first, avoiding complacency. Second, creating as much supply as possible. Third, engaging properly with the global economy. You know, Alan Greenspan was right when he said about a year ago that we can't be an oasis of prosperity in an impoverished global economy. And with Joe's help and the help of many others, I think we have worked through the Asian financial crisis and all that followed in a more successful way than many would have expected. But if there is one important safety valve on a high-pressure economy, it is the rest of the world. And that is why it is so important that we continue to stand for openness, that measures like China's inclusion into the WTO pass this year, and that we rebuild what I think is a lagging constituency in the United States for an internationalist orientation in economic policy. Because the last of the clouds is that substantial current account deficit that will likely be 4.5% of GNP this year. To be sure, in some ways the current account deficit is a sign of strength. I'd rather live in a country the capital was trying to get into than a country the capital was trying to get out of. In large part, it's a reflection of the fact that we've grown more rapidly than others and therefore sucked in imports. At the same time, it is ultimately would be more healthy to finance American investment with American savings. That's why increasing American savings and working to open and increase the growth rate of America's trading partners are crucial priorities for us at the Treasury. But let me just say that if anybody had said in 1990 that the sum of the inflation rate and the unemployment rate in the United States would be 6, if anyone had said in 1990 that productivity growth in the last quarter of the century, last quarter of the year of the last year of the century, would exceed 5%. If anyone had said in 1990 that the dominant concern would be whether Europe and Japan were going to be able to manage growth rates as much as half as high as the United States, if anybody had said in 1990 that the concern in financial markets wasn't going to be short-sighted corporations that were stopping the long term in the name of humoring short-term investors, but people who were valuing businesses highly, not on the basis of profits, not on the basis of revenues, but increasingly not even on the basis of plans. If anyone had said that that was going to be the dominant problem, people would have thought that something was being smoked. And so I think we can take a great deal of satisfaction with what's happened in our economy, even as we worry about challenges. I think we have opportunities to do things as a nation that would have seemed almost inconceivable 5 or 10 years ago. And that makes it an extraordinarily interesting and I think important time to be involved in public life. And that makes it especially important in a moment like this that we have someone in public life with the kind of insight and focus on both the economic and the moral elements that has distinguished Joe Lieberman during all his time in the Senate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rich. Thank you, Rich. And thanks to Ron Lake and Steve McMenamin, and also to David Fine, Charlie Heimbold, and Ed Silberman for the work they've done. Ed Silberman, it gives me particular pride to mention his name. He used to work for Chris Dodd, and Chris and I always say that one of our aims in life is to send our staff members up so that they can go out and make enough money to contribute to our reelection campaign. And Ed has achieved that remarkably well. I appreciate very much that everyone has come out to help me with my reelection campaign. There are those actually who, after my reelection in 1994, urged me not to run again on a theory that I had achieved the highest goal that a Democratic politician in the state could dream of, and there was nothing more to aspire to, and that was in 1994. I actually carried Greenwich. But I was not convinced by those arguments, and have continued to feel a special honor in being able to serve in the United States Senate and to be part of the discussions and decisions that affect the future of our country and the world. One of the most constructive and illuminating for me experiences of the last 7 years particularly has to work with this administration and its economic leadership team on stimulating economic growth, and particularly in the context of all the factors that you here in Greenwich and beyond understand as part of the new economy. And as a Democrat, I must say that I'm particularly proud that this party of mine has made a transition in the last decade back to where it was earlier in its history when it was at its most successful, which was to be identified and in fact to be a pro-economic growth party. That, as the former governor of Connecticut, Ella Grasso, taught me when she was governor and I was her state Senate majority leader, there's nothing better government can do than create the context for businesses to create jobs for people. And in a very different global high-tech information age economy, I think this administration has been able to regain the public's confidence in the capacity of Democrats to manage government and to put an emphasis on economic growth and to express an understanding that government doesn't create economic growth. Government creates the context, the environment in which the private sector can create growth. Bob Rubin, of course, we have to give credit to the President and Vice President, and the President early on took some real risks, particularly in the NAFTA and GATT agreements, to make that stand. But we've had an outstanding economic leadership team, beginning with Bob Rubin and now with Larry Summers, who of course was Bob's deputy. When Larry was kind enough to tell me that he was willing to come up and help my re-election campaign, I thought rather than doing the conventional and taking him either to New York or to Hartford, that I wanted to bring him here to what one of you this morning called the hedge fund colony. But of course, there's an enormous strength, almost use the word wealth, but there is wealth, an enormous richness of financial services and other related companies here. And so I'm very grateful that he's agreed to come. I want to leave time for Larry to speak and mostly to answer questions. He has to depart right around 9 for a call with the White House. So I'm going to be brief on the biography. Probably the most important thing, which is probably the aspect of his biography which is the least well known, but extremely relevant today, is that Larry Summers was born in New Haven, Connecticut. He's a graduate of MIT and Harvard, was on the Harvard faculty, went to the World Bank, and then joined the administration, and now is the United States' 71st Secretary of the Treasury. That's even more exclusive than being one of 100 senators. We are very lucky to have somebody of this brilliance and vision serving in America's public life today, and I'm very proud to present to you Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers. I do want to assure you that in Washington we are neither smoking nor inhaling. So these are real numbers. I am grateful for the generous support that you have given to my re-election campaign, but I must say that I'm particularly honored by the range and stature of the people who have given it. I appreciate very much this outpouring. And we should really go around, but we don't want to take the time. So if you have a question or when you do, please identify yourself so Larry has some sense of who we are. Who wants the first question? Steve.
I've got one. I'm Steve McMenamin from Oracle Partners. We had a speaker here about 6 months ago who described the 20th century as being the century of physics. That being the case, the 21st century would be the century of biology. Secretary Summers, with the mapping of the human genome about to be complete this summer, do you see any public policy implications on this, or is this another internet? Do you have any views?
I will answer your question since you asked it, but I harbor what may be the self-delusion that I have a little bit of expertise with respect to the topics that I was just talking about. I am under no such delusion with respect to your question. Let me say this: I think in terms of the opportunity for human betterment, the genetic revolution is on par with the information technology revolution. Bill Nordhaus, an economics professor at Yale, who some of you probably know, has recently done some research in which he's asked the question of people, if you had to choose between all the increases in life expectancy that we've had in the United States since 1950 and all the increases in material well-being that we've had since 1950, which is the larger contributor to improving the human condition? And most people, when it's all explained to them and they think about it, think it's the improvements in life expectancy. To the extent, therefore, that the genetic revolution has the potential to be a discontinuity in that area, as I'm inclined to think it does. It is potentially seismic with respect to the human condition, and since increasingly the thing people can't have with money right now is a solution to what ails you, I think the economic potential in this area is going to be enormous. In general, we've tried at the Treasury, I think with some success, to approach a range of economic issues from the perspective of the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. Or to put it differently, I remind my colleagues with respect to a number of issues where we're trying to think through what to do. If your watch is keeping time poorly, and the only tool at your disposal is a hammer, the fact that your watch is keeping time badly is not sufficient justification for intervening. I think that is a type of warning that is useful for us all to have in government. At the same time, I think there are going to be at least 3 places where government is going to have to intersect with this genetic revolution if its potential is going to be fully realized. First, it's going to have to continue to intersect as it has in the past by supporting the most basic research that is not appropriable in the private sector, or that, if appropriated, slows the process of growth. That's why the president has put forth what will be has put forth in his budget what will be the largest increase in the NIH budget in history, and he's, pardon one political observation here, and he's done that in the knowledge that the way the political dynamics always work out on this is that the Republican position on that issue is the Democratic position plus $500 million. Whatever the Democratic position is on that issue. So we're going to do a lot. We're going to do a lot for basic research. Second, the more there is to do, the more important it's going to be that we find ways of having everybody get their chance at it. This is not a country that's going to stay together in the way that it has stayed together so wonderfully over 200 years. If cancer is a solvable disease for rich people but not for poor people, it won't happen. And we are going to have to find ways of addressing the access challenge without chilling all the things that create the incentives that make all the stuff that's worth having access to. So I think that is probably going to be the most intellectually difficult economic policy question of the next decade, is thinking through the future of the healthcare system. It's something Charlie Heinbold and I have spent some time talking about. And the third issue is the set of issues around privacy and its connection to insurance markets. And I don't know what the answers are. I don't pretend to know what the answers are, but to just give the most vivid example of the problem. If you can look at somebody's genes and make an accurate assessment as to how long they are going to live, it is going to be impossible for the fathers or mothers of small children who are going to die when they're 38 to get life insurance, because somebody's going to be able to predict that. And that is going to be a source of a lot of economic insecurity. Now, markets work better with information and all of that. So I'm not telling you what the answer to the problem is. But the private market, left to its own sake, is not going to solve all of that. What would be a tragedy would be if we, as a country, let the last 2 problems I described, as serious and real as they are, somehow transmute into reasons to not get the enormous scientific opportunities that the genetic revolution is possible.
You know more about that subject than you let on. That was an excellent answer. Let me just add very briefly that the second factor is tied up in a process that we're engaged in right now in Congress, which is how do we cover the cost of prescription drugs for seniors under Medicare, and that's just the opening round of what will continue with the genetic revolution going on. And it has vast implications for the fiscal stability and balance of the federal government. Although my friends at Greenwich Capital tell me that while they admire my position about fiscal responsibility and maintaining a surplus and paying down the debt, they don't want me to retire the debt too quickly. Okay, who has the next question?
Yes, Michael Castine with Monster.com. And last week there was a breakfast here where we had people from Instant and McKinsey, and they were talking about the future of the world markets and how they're possibly changing with due to the internet and such. And I just wonder if you could comment, because some of the exchanges abroad are considered further advanced than the New York markets and such, and if you see that being an issue going forward for the U.S. economy.
It's a good question, and it's a question that falls much more in Arthur Levitt's bailiwick than in mine. I would just say that I think we've been enormously well served by having New York and its environs. I guess I should stress that here. Its environs a major, as a, if not the major global financial center. That I think the experience with Eurobonds, even 35 years ago, demonstrates very powerfully that you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And that if you chill things to the point where they move abroad, the consequences can be very long-lasting. And that is something that we need to be mindful of as we design regulations and rules. My sense is that this is a case where the barriers to necessary change probably lie less with public sector tradition than with problems in the design of private sector organizations that allow their judgments to be heavily colored by those with the strongest stake in the existing status quo. I am told, I don't know whether this is true, I've been told that the price-earnings ratio, the ratio of the price to the one-year rental for a New York Stock Exchange seat is not 30, not 20, not 10, but some number very much less than that. And I think that speaks to the importance of our finding ways of thinking through the restructuring of the country's markets, and that's certainly a process that we want very much to support. I would say that the ambiguities and difficulties in this area are pointed up by what I think is a central tension. On the one hand, an exchange is a source of, as a provider of liquidity, is a kind of natural monopoly. Everybody wants to be where everybody else is. On the other hand, there's an enormous advantage to competition and the spur that it brings. And whenever you have a situation where you have that tension between natural monopoly and economies of scale and the desirability of competition, you have a quite difficult, but I think a very important problem.
Next.
Yes. Steve McCarthy, KCG Capital. Comment and question. I guess Professor Benjamin Graham used to say that that value investor quaint concept that this time, the worst word in the English language of this time is different. Might be distinct this time. Part of the question is public policy. Right now, we're focused on public policy as the vehicle to end a prosperity. And one of the two levers of public policy, monetary policy, is moving in the wrong direction. What's happening from a fiscal policy point of view? We need to watch in the next 12 to 18 months to see if that turns against us. And number two, do you think that Japan needs a new version of John Maynard Keynes?
The way I like to tell your first observation is the three most dangerous words on a ski slope are "Follow me, Dad." And the four most dangerous words in markets are "It's dangerous this time." I feel pretty good about the fiscal policy. I think one of the striking things, again, if I could descend into politics, is the lack of traction which the idea of a massive pre-committed tax cut has generated. And so my guess is that we're going to do very well, that we're going to pay down a lot of debt in this country over the next several years. And I think paying down debt for some variety of reasons that you know is the most effective tax cut of all, because of the burden it takes from future generations, because of the pressure it takes off the credit markets, because of the investment because of the investment that it crowds in. With respect to Japan, whether it requires John Maynard Keynes or Margaret Thatcher is not entirely clear to me, but I think that after a decade of economic performance like the decade they've had, there's a strong case for some kind of discontinuity.
Yes.
One of the questions that Ken Tropman, Graham Capital. One of the questions that most of the people in finance here probably have is, as Chairman Greenspan has made it clear that he's very concerned about equity valuations and so on, you have this divergence between the old and the new economy equity markets. And the traditional tools of tightening monetary policy are apparently much less effective with the new economy markets than the old economy markets. And how does he grapple with, or how does the Federal Reserve grapple with the problem of damaging further old economy valuations while attempting to keep the temperature down on the new technology equity markets?
I think one of our bases for success has been the tone the President and Bob Rubin set literally within the first 2 weeks of the administration, which is one of respecting the independence of the Fed and not commenting on their monetary policy choices. But I would say as a general matter with respect to economic policy, while your question obviously pointed to some important trade-offs, our approach, I think I can include the Fed in this, has been to focus on the fundamentals of the economy, focus on what's happening to the economy's supply potential, focus on what's happening to inflationary pressures, focus on maintaining that kind of balance, and believe that if we manage the fundamentals of the economy right, including what's happening to demand versus supply, that things will work out in the right way, and that is a better approach than seeking to manage two markets or to target the level or to target the level of our markets. And so our concerns are much more with the demand-supply imbalance than they are with the levels of markets, much less with particular levels of particular sectors in markets.
That was that answer I would describe as Greenspan-esque.
That was wholly intentional.
Somebody else? Yes.
I'm Howard Pierce with ABB. Apologize for being a dirty fingernail manufacturer in the most of this. One of the issues that seems to me to be a major cloud on the horizon is the balance of trade. And I just wonder, do you feel that is a threat? And if so, is it an area that will receive or should receive public policy? I mean, we're gaining enormously from cheap imports, part of our productivity gain, and clearly turning that off isn't going to be a productive step. The real issue is what do we do in the other direction?
The trade and current account deficits were the third of the risks I cited in my initial remarks. That it reflects capital inflows to finance investment and reflects our relative economic strength is a good thing, but it is still a very real concern. But not, I think, a basis for a protectionist response, which I think would be catastrophic. But I think the right response is to increase savings so that we can maintain investment but finance more of it here, and to work to expand exports by promoting growth around the world and by working to open foreign markets. And that's why we put such emphasis on the fact that it's in our interest to see the rest of the world grow more rapidly.
Now, Larry talked about the importance of rebuilding or strengthening the consensus in this country for trade and for globalization. And you pointed to one side of it that we don't advocate enough, those of us who are free traders, and that is the very positive impact that imports have on inflation and on consumer accessibility to goods. And I hope that in the China WTO and PNTR debate that's coming soon, that we'll have an opportunity to do that. Obviously, there are other factors such as productivity that have technologically driven productivity increases that have had a major effect on this remarkable combination of high growth and low inflation. But imports have played a role as well, and I think we have to remind people of that as this debate goes forward.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask Larry, David Walsh of Walsh Associates, isn't the reverse of what you're asking happening? It's getting worse every month about savings, that the savings are going down in the United States, and in Japan, that was their policy, was to save. And they saved tremendously more than in the United States, and what happened to their economy? I mean, I don't know.
I think there are two parts. Let me take the second part and then the first part. Japan has had a successful set of policies since the Second World War to promote savings. Frankly, those policies were spectacularly successful for the first 35 years after the war. First 40 years after the war until the late 80s. Savings only works if you have a financial system that allocates savings to high productivity investment opportunities. Japan's financial system stopped doing that. It allocated it to Tokyo Golf Club memberships and the like. And with that breakdown in the financial system, you started getting, it's a melodramatic term, but it's not altogether wrong, a Soviet-style approach, which is, well, as long as it's capital, it's great. And that doesn't work. So savings to work have to be channeled into productive opportunities, which depends upon the financial system and the existence of productive opportunities. We've got a great financial system and a phenomenal stock of productive opportunities, and that's why savings are so important here. What do you do to promote? What do you do to promote savings? It is very hard, and some of it goes back to the complacency that I touched on at the beginning. My sense, and when I was in academic life, I actually worked on these questions a fair amount, is that savings, like life insurance, is sold, not bought. And that we need increasingly to find ways of motivating employers, motivating private sector financial institutions to promote to people the importance of their kind of retirement savings. And Joe Lieberman's leadership on the individual development account issue, which is directed at promoting savings access for those with low to medium income, has been an innovative and I think very important approach, and it's something the administration has tried to build on with our retirement savings account approach.
Yeah, this is a system, to state it in a sense, where we're trying to put the government, to have the government be an enabler of lower and middle income people to create the equivalent of the thrift saving plans that we have in the federal government, and then a lot of private sector companies have, where the government will actually match savings. financial institutions will match savings, and then the government will give them a credit for that, a tax credit. Yes, for that.
Jacob Levant from Warren International. Following on this savings question, I read an article recently that suggested that a big chunk of the recent decline in savings is actually artifactual. That savings are counted by corporate contributions to their pension plans, for example, which have been artifactually low because of the level of the stock market itself. First of all, do you agree with that sort of observation? And secondly, if you do, as policymakers, how do you take this kind of artifact out and prevent yourself from making bad policy on that data?
Yeah. Artifactual is an interesting word. The funds that are being made available for investment are genuinely down. It is true that a reason for that has to do with the lesser need to make contributions to defined benefit pension plans because the assets have done so well. But that doesn't do anything for the availability of funds to new investments and the consequences of borrowing from abroad. So I wouldn't totally accept the characterization of it. I would characterize what you said as a legitimate and accurate explanation, but not one that renders the decline in savings to be an artifact. I don't think, you don't always blow up a tire through the place where it leaked. And I don't want to fix it by taking money out of defined benefit pension plans. I think what we need to do is address, and I think this is something that is both socially important in terms of inequality, it is economically important in terms of the country's situation, and I think it's new economy important. However, the issues I was saying about access to cancer drugs and so forth, however that all plays out, life is that it's going to be a more flexible, dynamic economy, and people are going to need to fend for themselves a little more. And that's going to be true even if we do the best possible job in the public sector. And that's going to make it more important that people save in their own interests. And 70 million Americans, no 401k, no employer pension, no IRA, basically know nothing, except for some accumulation of home equity and very little in the way of liquid assets. Helping those people to do something about it has to be a central priority for the policy.
Maybe we should have one more question, and then let Larry head to the call. Yes.
Just to follow up on the conversations we've had about savings and clearly, everything venture capital, I apologize. Obviously, the interest we have in the debt. It seems like Social Security would be an issue that would tie a lot of these things together in terms of looking at the budget and the realities of pay downs versus the out years, and talking about savings and empowering people to save another way. Is that going to be a political issue going forward? It seems like it's sort of passed to some extent for this election season. Is it next year's issue? Are there thoughts about it?
I think it's a very good question. I think Social Security reform is not going to happen this year. It's the political stuff like that. What will happen at the beginning of the next cycle, I think, is hard to tell. Frankly, the spectacular growth of the economy in the last year or two has made some of the more long-run forecasts look so dire 2 or 3 years ago look less dire. And as somebody said, in a democracy, fear does the work of reason. And fear around these issues is heavily attenuated. So I don't know how quickly the country will come back to the question of Social Security. But I think it is very much to be hoped that we will in some way, working through the Social Security system, use a large part of the benefits of this debt pay down to meet what doesn't show up in the national income accounts, but is after all the most important debt the government has in the form of a fixed, real obligation, which is the obligation to pay off the Social Security for us and for our generation, and the obligation to address what Charlie knows so much more about than I do, which is the health care needs of the seniors. And to the extent that we are as successful as Steve thinks we're going to be on the biotech side, that is a wonderful thing, but it is not a cheap thing, and that makes your emphasis on addressing the Social Security all the more important.
I do think we have Larry's political estimate is absolutely right. There's no chance that anything substantial will happen on this year, but it will come back in 2001. And there is a bipartisan group of senators that's working on this and has some ideas for the future. I was thinking about the question about Japan and how obviously this is all balanced. I was at a seminar that CSIS held last week on Japan-U.S. relations. There were a number of people there from Japanese private and public sector, and it's pretty clear, just to get the other side of our concern about low savings, that the savings in Japan are high now. They all say not primarily because of the traditional Japanese cultural emphasis on savings. They're high now because of anxiety about the future. So the low savings rate of the U.S. is in part, as Larry said, a reflection of broad optimism about the future. On the other hand, it still is a warning sign. So we have to find our way back to a kind of balance, and hopefully government can facilitate and enable some of that. I hope this has been as interesting a morning for you as it has been for me. I thank you very, very much for your support. I thank Larry for taking the time to come up here. We're grateful for your time, but also grateful, as I said at the outset, for your service. And I'm very proud, as a pro-growth, pro-business Democrat, that I could get you all out there early to help the GDP rise today. Thank you very much.